So could you have the female phenotype of autism? I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and as I uncover information, I share it here. And I've been making many videos on this topic, but I've done an even deeper dive. And this really is for you, for clinicians and assessors, anyone who is like not necessarily where they should be in terms of understanding what the female phenotype of autism might look like. Really quickly, we don't really love this language, female, male, autism, things like that. And for this exact prototype or type, it tends to be more common among those without intellectual disabilities. Number one, that's really important when we're talking about this phenotype because it's much harder, and the research shows, to identify those who have autism who do not have an intellectual disability. So if you're a girl and you have an intellectual disability, you're much more likely to be identified. Okay, so the point is though that with that being said, and if you are someone who is non-gender conforming, male, female, however you identify, we'd like to get away from this genderizing language, but this phenotype does tend to present, especially among girls and women, and that is what I wanted to share with you. But like I'm saying, anyone can have this type. Number one, if you or someone you love has been diagnosed with borderline, especially borderline personality, and there's a cluster of traits that feel like, I can't fully explain those, but most of it goes in the box of BPD. Many articles and research articles are suggesting an autism screening for any person who tends to present with the classic BPD symptoms, which historically has been girls and women. But the research also shows, as we're talking about the role of trauma and childhood, that for many autistic people, instead of receiving a diagnosis of PTSD, they tend to present more with anxiety and depression, at least in terms of how clinicians in a lot of research are describing it. So some research is showing that people might say that they feel like they've had trauma symptoms, but they don't fit the original DSM criteria of PTSD because it significantly leaves out things like adverse childhood events, the little t traumas, the complex PTSD traumas, and that for many autistic people, by the way, we are more susceptible to those traumas and more susceptible to the outcome impacting us. So BPD, anxiety, depression, a PTSD presentation, but especially as it might fit that BPD cluster. Number two, the person is generally considered to be highly sensitive, high maintenance, picky, maybe rigid, easily dysregulated. It's like they need to have their world just so, or things are quite challenging. And it might look like, oh, you're just being a diva or demanding. But the root of this dysregulation, this sensitivity to the world, is often coming from the impact of the brain and as it interacts with the environment and sensory issues, all of those things. And really quickly, just as an aside, make sure you keep clear in your mind that those girls or women who may have autism, who know how to make eye contact and who have empathy, should not be taken off the assessment criteria in terms of identification. It is very clear that for many autistic people, we know how long to hold eye contact, so you may not recognize it, especially if you were socialized in traditional environments where girls and women are taught to be more social. That is going to be something that you experience as distress, maybe your efforts to maintain eye contact, but it might not present that way. And the same thing goes for empathy. We know that autistic people might express empathy differently, hence the double empathy problem theory. But the bottom line is, just because someone who presents as less empathic and is a girl or woman, that you would say, oh, that's not autism. In fact, that might actually, the girl presentations that get diagnosed actually are going to look more like the historically boy presentations, because that is what autism criteria and assessments and all of it from the ground up, from Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger's on. The study groups, the research, the writing has all been so boy-centric. And so we just want to keep understanding and challenging that. Number 3, massive sensory issues across the board. Now, they might be stronger in some places, right? Your sense of smell is a huge trigger, but you can handle loud noises. But generally, you're going to find a collection of sensory issues. And in addition to that, so we're talking about, right, lighting, sound, food texture, material, clothing texture, everything, what you can smell. For me, smell is the biggest trigger for me that's sort of rage inducing. But the bottom line is you will see those. And I also believe we don't talk enough about it. And there's a whole interesting conversation and research around autism and sexuality and expressions of sexuality and gender and things like that. But and research supported. But I would say that intimacy. So in terms of actually being intimate, kissing, holding hands, touch, smell, taste, I think for a lot of autistic people, there's a lot of triggers in that we've sort of been taught to sort of push through, but that are inherently dysregulating. Number 4, a trail of friendship issues in some way. So they might be good at making friends, but not so great, the research shows, at maintaining friendships. Some research on girls shows that they might be able to hang out in the periphery of friend groups, so it looks like they belong, but they're not necessarily having that reciprocity in friendship that they might like. Alongside that, we might see a person being, overly shy or quiet or anxious. They might be overly blunt and direct in their communication. And the bottom line here, I know I always say the bottom line, is that girls are often, in terms of this phenotype especially, more socially motivated and more motivated in general and for friendship. And some research shows that in terms of the female autistic brain, the way executive functioning issues play out for us, and it's hard to figure out exactly, what came first, but that we might inherently have a little bit more extra support from a brain perspective in terms of socializing. So that also might make it harder to identify in us. Number 5, stimming. Now, what I've seen, the stimming obviously looks like skin picking, hair twirling. It could be things like tapping your foot, but a lot of like repeating lyrics in your head, rewatching the same shows over and over and over again, listening to certain music over and over again. So it could be internal or external repetition in terms of stimming, but also we're going to get to that really quickly, that girls on the spectrum tend to engage in less repetitive behaviors than boys. And so in general, we might not see that as much. But the bottom line is stimming. Number 6, I think a lot of this sort of like empathic, naive, smart, dumb. I describe it as, it's not dumb and it's also incredibly smart. But it can be this mismatch between how I think that we are often girls on the spectrum, because we take things at face value and aren't looking, and this isn't true for everyone, of course, but I'm just, in my experience, have been taught to sort of like, not taught to look for subtext, I guess I would say, in terms of trusting people. And I just saw a TikTok, it was talking about this video with Taylor and Travis recently, and how he's giving this energy of like, being able to turn off your brain with your man, kind of a thing. And I was thinking about, people with autism also being more susceptible to narcissistic abuse and things like that. And I wonder if it's because for many of us, there is that constant chaos inside, and then dialogue and the idea that someone like a narcissist could come along and present the idea that they've got this, you're safe in the beginning. They can contain all of that, not just for, how we are as human beings, like just giving it a rest. But I will say that the female brain, I think in general, and the autistic brain together, separately and together, are really often working overtime when you think about our place in the world, just in terms of our assessment of safety. Who's looking at me? Where am I going? Historically, all of that is going to make us, frankly, more wired for that. But I think there can be this sort of like, and they've called it childlike, and it may be, but it's sort of, I think it's just this naive vision of the world at times where you just don't assume the worst, or you think people will be direct and they're not. Number 7, this is the same thing, talking about how the impact of autism plays out. So you might see a lot of, bed rotting, girl rotting, which is basically like, it could be depression for sure, but also just a lot of like isolating, separating, needing time alone to regulate. And there's where you might rewatch things or whatever it is, or have your little, like I get in my bed every night at 6 and start watching my shows. I'm not necessarily sleepy. It's just a way for me to down regulate. And it can also be a way to help us prevent burnout. So that can be very common. As it obviously can move into frequent depression for us, there can be a fine line there. So you might see that. But I would argue that a lot of the hypervigilance and anxiety and the brain going so much makes the idea of isolating and only feeling safe in your body, especially with an overly active nervous system, more likely. And then, as I keep saying, I think so many of us who are autistic do have eggshell parents, and they were either autistic themselves or have their own trauma. And so there can be this just like, I'm only safe, I'm only relaxed when I'm alone, when I'm in control of what's happening. Number 8, a lot of social anxiety and rumination. So rumination is incredibly common in autistic females and in women and girls. And this idea of literally, like I'm talking about, like, hovering over yourself, being anxious about things before, during, after, when you are talking to someone, being overly aware of eye contact and what you're saying and not oversharing or maybe oversharing, and then ruminating about that so much afterwards. Oh my God, why did I say that? And anybody with social anxiety or anxiety can do this. But this is really especially around how we find ourselves interacting with others. And so it really is this hypervigilant, I believe, is the huge crossover hypervigilance between trauma and autism. And it makes us just more likely to be afraid of rejection and anticipation and rumination. So that's the core, rumination tied to a lot of those factors. Now, number 9 is, I wrote this it's good girl syndrome. It's like for many autistic for girls on this presentation, they've learned how to mask and fit in and be good and appropriate. And so yet deep inside, there might be a lot of other things going on. Or at school, they're this way, and at home, they're different. But learning to be polite and academic and compliant, a lot of this thinking that I have to be this version, and that might go with clothing and hair and makeup and all of those things. Remember that for many girls and women, their special interests might be very typical genderized girl interests, music, pop culture, horses, and the research does show that. And so there can also be within those a very deep dive. It's not just a skimming the surface thing, but that's important. Number 11 is you probably have some form of chronic illness, PCOS, POTS, Ehlers-Danlos, autoimmune, and it's hard to say yet. Is it? I don't know this yet. I haven't done enough of a deep dive. But when you look at it, seems like autistic people have a propensity and are more at risk for many different chronic illnesses. And you add in the role that trauma can play in the nervous system and that chronic stress response. I think you will find, though, that many people that I've seen with the female phenotype presentation have some form of chronic illness. Autoimmune, like I'm saying, fibromyalgia, there's research on that as well. And lastly, number 12 is if you think you have, or the person that you think is autistic and may have this type, they tend to have also, because there's so much overlap with ADHD, and ADHD presentation as well. So it could be that they are predominantly autistic, but they have these, more ADHD related dynamics. But when we look at a lot of the criteria, they really do overlap. And there is some research says 30 up to 75% likelihood and comorbidity. If you have autism, you also have ADHD. And so if you have what you thought, and it may just be ADHD, but there could be something worth looking at if you thought that's what was going on, and yet everything else I've described also is happening for you, alongside things that fit under the autistic umbrella in terms of diagnoses. So that's where I'm at so far. I've been watching a lot of videos on these topics, but I just wanted to say and share, because I keep coming across, I'll share another link down below, the missed and misdiagnoses of autistic females and girls and women, especially that because of the lack of research, and even I just read a TikTok on a post, they said, when I type in female phenotype autism into the search bar on Google, not that much comes up. And what I'm watching researchers say is like, we don't necessarily love these words, but this needs to be understood, because like I keep saying, if I didn't know about this presentation, I would have never begun my deep dive on autism. So those are, I think, some of the top things. There are many videos on this topic, but I feel like this is the most recent research I found, and I hope you find it helpful. So thank you for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Bye.